Welcome to Pox Couture. This tutorial will cover all the steps you'll need to create the Skylar tuck blouse. So let's get sewing. I'm starting off with the collar right side up. Place the raw edge of the cording even with the edge of the collar. When you get to the curve, clip the cording up to the stitch line, but be careful not to clip the thread. If you're interested in making your own cording, stay tuned till the end of the video. Continue pinning both collar pieces, then stay stitch using 3/16 to 1/8 of an inch using a regular presser foot or cording foot. The small scissors keeps my fingers away from the sewing needle and helps me feed the fabric through the machine. You should have the right and left collar pieces stay stitched with the cording. Then match one of the collar pieces that doesn't have the cording to one that does. Match up the back and front notches and sew along the edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you're done, trim the curves with pinking shears. If you don't have pinking shears, cut out the wedges using the tips of your scissors. Now that you have your collars sewn, place them aside till later. When you cut the pattern, you might have noticed all the notches at the top and bottom of the front bodice. These are indicators telling you where the tucks will go. Before we start, find the center front and mark it with a pin. The first notch on either side of the center front will be the start of the first tuck. Then you'll have a pause and the second round of tucks. As you can see, the last 2 tucks farthest from center front are already sewn. So let me show you how you're going to go about sewing these tucks. First, match the notches at the top and place the garment into the sewing machine. The fold should be on the 1/4 inch seam allowance mark. Since the tucks are a decorative detail, make sure you have the fabric wrong sides together. Before you start sewing, match the corresponding notches at the bottom and with your fingers lightly crease the fabric. This will make it easier to sew. When you're done sewing all the tucks, you'll want to press them away from center front. The sleeves are the easiest. First, sew the basting stitch a 1/2 inch away from the edge. Start in the middle of the back front notch and the control notches. Cut the top thread short, but leave the bobbin threads long. This will make it easier when gathering. Then sew another basting stitch a 1/4 inch away from the edge and cut the thread the same as before. Now repeat these steps to the other sleeve. When you have both sleeves done, sew the underseam with the fabric right sides together. Press the seams open and serge or use pinking shears to take care of any fray edges. To finish the hem of the sleeves, fold 1/2 inch and press. Then match the raw edge to the fold. Pin and sew along the fold using the inside of the presser foot as a guide. Don't worry about back stitching. When you come back around, you'll continue to stitch past the first stitch by a maximum of 3 stitches. This will ensure that the thread doesn't unravel. When you have both sleeves finished, place them aside. Sewing the back zipper. First, match all the back notches, then set your machine to a basting stitch. Sew a basting stitch without back stitching. When you get to the 2 notches, stop, but do not take the garment out of the machine. Instead, set the stitch length back to normal. Sew 2 to 3 stitches and back stitch the same amount. Then continue sewing till you reach the hem and back stitch to finish the seam. Press the seam open and serge or use pinking shears to finish the raw edges. Once you press the seam open, remove just the basting stitch and change the presser foot to a zipper foot. Attach the zipper by matching the top of the zipper tape to the top of the back neck and the edge of the zipper teeth to the fold, and pin if desired. I've lined up the edge to the 1/4 inch mark on the sewing machine. When you get to the end, make sure you have the needle down, lift the presser foot to close the zipper. Sew past the notch point, pivot, and sew across. Note, count the stitches to make sure that they are even on both sides. For example, if you have 2.5 stitches on the left side of the center back, then make sure that you have 2.5 stitches on the right side of the center back. Pivot and continue sewing. This is where it gets tricky because you don't have a guide. It's best if you keep the zipper closed while matching the fold edges as you sew. This will give you a perfect railroad zipper. Right before you come to the end, set the needle down, lift the presser foot, open the zipper, and continue sewing. At this point, you'll want to check that the folded edges line up and that the neckline matches, meaning that you don't have one side taller than the other. Shortening the zipper. The end of the zipper is like a staple. With pliers, you'll want to lift the edges. If you have pliers that can't get underneath them, like mine, use old scissors or something sharp to pry them up. With pliers, uncurl the ends, flip the tape over and remove the metal piece. Reposition it, making the zipper shorter, then close the ends. Cut the tape 1/2 inch from the metal piece, and you're done. Place the front and back bodice right sides together and sew the shoulder seam using 1/2 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowance open and serge or use pinking shears to finish the raw edges. To attach the collar, you'll need the bias piece and both collar pieces. Unzip the zipper and place the collar right sides together and match center back notch, shoulder notch, and center front notch. Then pin between notches. Leave a starting tail of about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch on the bias piece, then match the edges as you sew. Bias tape is very easy to stretch, so make sure to avoid stretching it. You'll be able to tell if the bias tape was stretched because it will twist and look very unattractive. When you're done sewing, you can trim the bias tape down to 1/2 inch. If you have any cording sticking out of the neckline, you can trim it down. This is the perfect time to check the center back neck. You don't want to have one higher than the other, so if you do, double check your sewing and even them out. Finishing the bias tape ends. Fold the ends inwards and down into itself. Sew along the fold using the inside of the presser foot as a guide. Sewing the side seam. Place the fabric right sides together and sew using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press open. Serge or use pinking shears to finish the raw edges. Attaching the sleeves. Match the sleeve and the bodice with the right sides together. First, match the underseam to the side seam and the top notch of the sleeve with the shoulder seam. Then match the front and back bodice notches. Then match the control notches located on the front or back of the sleeve and bodice and gather the sleeve. Distribute the gathers evenly using a nail, scissors, or pins. Start sewing using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Don't worry about back stitching. When you come back around, you'll continue to sew, passing the first stitch about 3 stitches. If you end up having a row of gathering stitches that are seen from the outside of the garment, then remove only that row and leave the other row as is. Then serge or use pinking shears to finish the raw edges. Make sure to repeat these steps on the other sleeve. Now to finish the hem, like the sleeve, fold 1/2 inch and press. Then fold the raw edge to the fold and pin. Sew using the inside of the presser foot as the guide, and do not worry about back stitching. When you come back around, you'll continue to sew past the first stitch using 3 stitches. This will ensure that it doesn't unravel. Decorative buttons. Now comes the fun part, adding the finishing touches. I found these buttons adding a nice touch to the shirt. Start with a needle with the thread doubled and the knot at the end. Start sewing from the outside of the garment to hide the knot. Then sew 3 passes and knot the ends twice, and you're done sewing 1 button. Continue sewing 2 more buttons for this look. Hook and eye. Hook and eyes can be tricky because they're so small. If you're starting out, use a size 2, but a size 1 would be best. Again, when you start, make sure you have the thread doubled and knotted at the end. Start by hiding a knot through the garment and attach the eye first. The end of the eye should be at the edge of the bias tape. Sew the hole with 3 passes, and on the 3rd one, have the needle come out on top of the loop. This will hold it flat against the garment. Again, make 3 passes, and on the 3rd one, have the needle come out on the other side to repeat this step on the other side. After the 3rd pass, have it come out on the curled loop, and after the 3rd pass, knot the end twice and hide the end of the thread. Close the hook and eye before sewing and mark the location. Then whip stitch over both holes and under the net of the hook. Pass the needle of the thread through the fabric and the end of the hook. Whip stitch over end to hold it flat against the garment. Just sew it to the surface of the bias tape. Cording. Cut 1 inch wide bias tape about 1 yard and 1 yard of piping cording. Cording is about 1/8 inch wide. Wrap the bias around the cording with right sides of the fabric out and pin. With the cording foot, stitch the top of the cording and the bias tape. This will keep the cording from sliding out while you sew. Pivot and stitch the length of the bias tape, making sure not to crowd the stitches against the cord. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial and don't forget to post your finished projects on my Flickr group.